I've arranged to meet up with Bert's nephew, Malcolm Brocklesby.
You knew Bert. What was he like?
Well, my memory of him is that he was a large, avuncular character.
Yeah.
And when he was around, there was usually a lot of laughter.
Right, so he wasn't dour. You get this image of a very serious, earnest man.
He could be serious at times, but he was certainly not a dour character.
Do you feel his conscientious objection was something that was absolutely rigid?
The key thing was thou shalt not kill. The other thing was that he said you will demonstrate your Christianity by what you actually do.
Right.
And I think this was the strong basic principle on one hand, and the belief that you've got to demonstrate that with your behaviour that came together.
Hence his determination to resist.
Yes, there's a stubborn streak trying to get out from time to time.
The army tried to break Bert's resolve, constantly pressing him to sign up. In response, he and the other absolutists began a campaign of passive resistance. They refused to dress in uniform. They would not go out on parade. Bert even refused to peel potatoes.
The prisoners kept up their spirits, not just by drawing on the walls, but by praying and singing together. Bert's neighbour, Norman Gordy, led the singing and tapped out the rhythm on the concrete floor. Their favourite, apparently, was Nearer My God to Thee, with Bert providing a rousing bass.
While Bert continued his protest, his younger brothers, Harold and Phil, prepared for the Somme offensive. They were among 400,000 men who gathered along an 18-mile front. This would be, the army hoped, the big push, the decisive battle to end the whole war. Bert, too, found himself involved. Unable to break his resistance, the army came up with a bizarre plan. The prisoners were brought here, to the port of Boulogne in northern France, where thousands of troops were stationed before heading off to the Somme.
Incredibly, Bert and his fellow prisoners were allowed time off to look round the town, as though they were tourists. They came down here to the beach, went for a paddle, played football, and being English, pooled their money together and had a nice cup of tea. Quite what the British troops stationed here thought of all this is difficult to imagine.
But the beach holiday didn't last long. Bert and the other prisoners were marched to the top of the cliffs overlooking the harbour, where an army camp had been set up. Here, in what is today a children's park, they faced a military court, charged with disobedience. On the 24th of June 1916, Bert Brocklesby was ordered into the parade ground, where hundreds of soldiers had gathered to hear the court's verdict.
The captain read out the sentence of the court. The accused, he said, are found guilty and sentenced to death.
Bert was one of at least 50 absolutists sentenced to death during the war. But none of the sentences were ever carried out. It was, in truth, a sham, pure theatre, an exercise in intimidation. Bert was transferred to Dice Work Camp near Aberdeen to begin a sentence of hard labour. The absolutists were often badly treated in prison. Many guards were unsympathetic former soldiers, and physical abuse of conchies was commonplace. 73 conscientious objectors died as a result of their punishment. Several committed suicide.
The harsh treatment received by the absolutists still provokes conflicting reactions, from "that's terrible" to "so what?" Yes, Bert and his fellow COs suffered for their pacifist beliefs, but millions of men on the front line believed, or at least trusted, that their efforts would bring about peace in Europe. So how much sympathy do the absolutists deserve?
While Bert served his sentence, his brothers Harold and Phil were in the trenches. On the 1st of July 1916, the men of Conisbrough went over the top at the Somme. In that day alone, 60,000 men were killed or wounded. Phil later wrote home, "Hell, that's what it was. Long, horrible wars like this one are one of the strongest arguments for conscientious objectors." Harold and Phil survived. They were incredibly lucky. Huge numbers of families were left in mourning.
One can't help wonder how Bert would have felt if one or both of his brothers had been killed. Would that have challenged the certainty of his pacifism? Or would it have made him even more stubborn in his convictions?
Absolutists like Bert took their religion to the extreme. Most men of faith set aside any reservations they had about taking life to serve what they believed was a greater good. But what if, once in the midst of battle, their convictions changed? What if a soldier began to question the morality of the war? What if doing his patriotic duty turned him into a conscientious objector? This is the Imperial War Museum in London, one of the world's leading military archives. Here we can find evidence of a soldier who became a conscientious objector during his service in the Great War. In the reading room, there's a remarkable memoir written by war veteran Ronald Skirth. He dedicated it to his wartime girlfriend and future wife, Ella Christian.
Skirth recounts how, as a naive young recruit, he was trained not just physically, but mentally too. He writes, "The chaplains had convinced me of the righteousness of our cause and assured us that God would grant us the victory we deserved. They preached to us that it was His will that the Germans, those fiends in human form, should be destroyed. I really did think that I and my friends were protecting our sisters and our sweethearts from fates worse than death."
Ronald Skirth trained as an artillery observer. At the front, it would be his job to find enemy targets and direct the battery's shell fire. Jean Skirth is Ronald's only daughter.
Hello.
Hello, Jean.
I recognise your face.
Very nice to meet you.
Jean has kept some of the more personal sections of her father's war memoir.
You've got the very first page of his memoir, and is that your parents?
Yes, that's my mother, Ella, and that's Dad. Picture especially taken before he joined the army.
They look terribly young,
Yes.
and almost like children.
Yes, well, they did actually meet at a musical evening.
Right.
He fell in love with her. And he's written what time. It was 7 o'clock on the 26th of July in 1916. And she sang and he played the piano. No, I mean, how more romantic
Could you get? Absolutely. Just a few months after meeting Ella, Ronald Skirth volunteered for what he saw as a great adventure. He took with him a treasured possession, a book of poetry.
This is a copy of The Golden Treasury by F.T. Palgrave. It's got his name, and as you can
What's
see...
he interested in? The romantics.
Well, yes, of course. I mean, he's romantic to the end, wasn't he?
Keats, Shelley,
Yeah.
Wordsworth. Gosh, there's a poem called Ode to Duty, and he's written in his handwriting, "There's only one way of happiness for man, obedience."
Yes, oh well, yes. He was inclined to be idealistic. He felt that, you know, you had to go and fight for your country, you know, fight for God and country.
The young idealist was soon transferred to Belgium, where he came face to face with the true horrors of the war.